Iraq. In addition to providing security, the military has trained and equipped Iraq's security forces and has overseen billions of dollars of reconstruction projects. The military has also provided vital support to the other U.S. agencies operating in Iraq: food, housing, transportation, and medical evacuation. Services have all been managed or carried out by the Defense Department. All that is about to change under President Bush. Agreements with the government of Iraq. U.S. military forces are to complete their exit from Iraq by December 31st, 2011. As a result, we have reached a new phase in Iraq, a phase that places less reliance on our troops and more on our civilian agencies. This new phase has been called Operation New Dawn, but from where I am sitting, it should have been called Operation New Challenges. As we reduce the number of troops in Iraq, many duties now performed by the military will be transferred to the State Department. The size and complexity of State's new role in Iraq is unprecedented. Numerous important issues appear to be unresolved. The State Department will take over many functions that are inherently military, for which State has little or no expertise. This raises important practical questions. Who will provide security for State Department employees? Who will recover personnel who are wounded or killed? Who will provide convoy security? Who will provide counter-fire and rocket, artillery, and other mortar attacks? Who will recover damaged vehicles and downed aircraft? Who will provide explosives disposal? Even basic questions of what military equipment will be transferred to the State Department and who will apply rules for the use of force have still not been settled. Without the State Department having the expertise of the staff to carry out these functions, State will be forced to turn to contractors to fill this gap. For example, the Wartime Contracting Commission estimates that State will need more than double the number of security contractors it currently has in Iraq, to as many as 7,000. The State Department must also grapple with how it intends to provide basic life support services. Despite poor past performance by KBR, the Army recently made the highly controversial decision to extend KBR's sole source contract under LOGCAP III instead of competing under LOGCAP IV. The implications of this Army decision are unclear. With the huge increase in the number of contractors and contracting costs, the State Department will need to closely monitor these contracts. Unfortunately, providing effective contract oversight has not been the State Department's strongest suit. The State Department Inspector General, the Special Inspector General of Iraq Reconstruction, and GAO have all found significant weaknesses in the State Department's contract management in Iraq. Even the State Department's Assistant Secretary of Management has acknowledged a lack of contract experience and expertise within the agency. 6 months ago, Ambassador Patrick Kennedy wrote to the Defense Department outlining these issues and requesting help. Defense has still not fully responded. This apparent lack of cooperation is unacceptable. These issues cannot be ignored. We cannot sit on the sidelines and hope these problems take care of themselves. The risks are too high to botch the transition, and we cannot turn a blind eye to reckless contractors. We cannot afford to lose the gains our servicemen and women have fought so hard for over these years. I look forward to hearing testimony from the Commission on Wartime Contracting as well as the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction. Both the Commission and the IG have completed important work in these areas and continue to be an important asset to the Congress. At this point, I would like to yield 5 minutes to the ranking member of the committee and say to him that these digs over here are just temporarily. We will be moving back to our regular quarters after the completion.
Mr. Chairman, on so many things we find common ground. We find the ability to come together and to agree. Today's hearing is an example. Leaving these digs is not. Mr. Chairman, today's hearing is important, and it's bipartisan. Now, we use the word bipartisan, nonpartisan, all these other things pretty often around here. It's pretty clear that the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, although supportive of the troops, have not always been equally supported on both sides. But as we are nearly 2 years into a new administration, and America's vital national interests have fully transitioned from one President and one administration to another, and persistent problems remain, as the Commission on Wartime Contracting issues its report, the Special IG's reports have been keenly looked at by this committee. It's pretty clear that 7, 8 years of one President in war and 2 years of another President in war look a lot the same. We are going to hear today about a number of needs in the transition. These are not new needs. Certainly, this committee has staked out a great deal of jurisdiction over the question of outsourcing of inherently governmental activities. In fact, no committee owns more of the responsibility to get it right in the future than this. The Diplomatic Security Service is woefully understaffed. Now, 9 years ago, when that was the case, nobody was surprised. First one and then another war in which diplomats in great numbers were deployed while we were still at war and or in an occupation created a unique need. So we never intended our diplomatic services to need attack helicopters, overhead eye in the sky, Predator drones, and the like, but they did. Now, nearly a decade later, and 2 presidents into 2 wars, we realize that there is an ongoing elevated need for a level of security to be provided for our diplomats that is not appropriate to provide by uniformed services. It is not that the U.S. Army, Navy, Air Force haven't done a great job. They have. But they are not, in fact, the appropriate people to stand by a diplomat as he goes in saying, this is about peace. Our Marines, and I represent Camp Pendleton, have for virtually our entire time as a country guarded embassies. But as the diplomats go out, they need to go out in civilian clothes with to the greatest extent possible, a peacetime look. This is not currently possible through government employees. And the contracting system has been controversial. One, because it costs a great deal to employ somebody in these areas, and because it has been viewed as temporary, and as a result, the high cost and the lack of a systematic approach for what their rules of engagement will be have caused us diplomatic problems time and time again. This committee has held hearings on many of those diplomatic problems. Although this committee often looks at waste, fraud, and abuse through the eyes of dollars, and the projected cost and overruns that we will discuss today are huge and need to be addressed, I think this committee has an obligation to bring light today on the fact that after 7 years in Iraq and a declared mission accomplished twice, we have to make sure that the powers that remain with the assets they need, and appropriately, when inherently governmental, use governmental assets. Over the years, I have met with contractors who provide security services. Of course, they do it for compensation. But time and time again, they have said, this is not our company's core requirement. This is not what we do. These companies very rightfully would give that up in a transition, and that transition is long overdue. So as we talk to 2 panels of learned experts, I hope that we will focus on what we don't have today but should have had several years ago, a transition that in many cases has not really begun, and how we go forward from here on a bipartisan basis. Mr. Chairman, I know we can do this together. I know that the cost overruns and the sins of the past are just that, but we now have it on our watch, and I look forward to working together on this. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman for his statement. Look forward to working with him. At this time, I'd like to ask the witnesses to please stand and raise your right hand. We swear all of our witnesses in. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth and nothing but the whole truth? If so, answer in the affirmative. Let the record reflect that both witnesses answered in the affirmative. Mr. Michael Thibeault is a co-chair of the Commission on Wartime Contracting. Before being appointed to the Commission, Mr. Thibeault spent his career in public service at the Defense Contracting Audit Agency. From 1994 until his retirement from DCAA, Mr. Thibeault served as the Deputy Director for the agency. Mr. Thibeault is also a decorated Vietnam veteran, serving in the United States Army from 1965 to 1968. We welcome you this morning. And Mr. Grant Green is one of the 6 commissioners who serves with the 2 chairs on the Commission on Wartime Contracting. Highlights from Mr. Green's career include appointment as Undersecretary of State for Management and Assistant Secretary of Defense. Mr. Green also spent 22 years in the United States Army and is currently the chairman of a business consulting firm. Welcome you. At this time, I ask the witnesses to deliver their 5-minute testimony. I understand that you, Mr. Thibeault, will be delivering testimony on behalf of the Commission. And let me just say that even in our new digs, I understand that you start out, the light is on green, and then all of a sudden it moves to yellow, which cautions, which means that you have 1 minute to summarize from that point. And as everywhere in the United States of America, red means stop. And of course, when the red light comes on, that means stop. And of course, which will allow us an opportunity to raise questions with you. Let me thank both of you for being here this morning. And of course, at this time, Mr. Thibeault, you have 5 minutes to give your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Towns, Ranking Member Issa, and other members of the committee. I am Michael Thibeault, co-chair of the Commission on Wartime Contracting in Iraq and Afghanistan. Beside me is Commissioner Grant Green. Thank you for inviting us to testify today. I'll briefly summarize our joint statement and request the full statement be entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. First, I would like to state that my co-chair, Chris Shays, who has worked with me extensively as well as with this committee in his past, very graciously asked Commissioner Green, because of the background that you recognized, that he sit in and provide testimony. I'm not sure I could have done that, but he did, and Commissioner Shays, as you mentioned, bipartisan, absolutely in sync with our efforts today. And has
we were looking forward to seeing him because he served on this committee for a number of years. So I'm happy to know that he didn't feel it was a conflict of interest.
Well, we had a few questions for him from his time here that we're still hoping to ask.
Thank you.
And we wanted to show him our new digs.
Yeah. All right. The future of the new Iraq is unsettled. This past Sunday, as the Washington Post reported, 6 car bombings in Baghdad and a suicide bombing in Fallujah killed 37 people and wounded more than 100. Iraq remains a dangerous place. The combination of a military withdrawal, a persistent security threat, and a return to customary intragovernmental relations brings us to our concerns for this hearing. The U.S. Embassy will remain after U.S. troops withdraw from Iraq. These circumstances combine to create what may be a unique situation in American history, a diplomatic presence reestablished and expanding in a country that appears unable to provide normal host country security and services while the U.S. military withdraws. The scheduled withdrawal of the U.S. military forces leaves State very little time to arrange for the alternative provision of functions. One example best highlights the many challenges facing the State Department. When insurgents attack United States bases, they often include rocket and other indirect fire as part of that attack. Presently, the U.S. Army has a sophisticated and highly effective system to provide immediate warning for these rocket attacks. This system is called the Counter-Rocket and Mortar System. Within seconds of an enemy rocket or mortar launch, there is a warning for all base occupants. This system has saved countless lives. Also included is a counter-battery system where military indirect fire experts locate and return fire onto enemy insurgents. This counter-battery effort takes 6 to 8 seconds and is critical. As a result, enemy insurgents seldom fire more than one rocket, as they know they will be targeted. The State Department recently received an unsolicited contractor proposal and now has identified a commercial variant to replace the current system. They're presently evaluating how this system can be acquired. Even more troubling in this example, State Department executives informed us this week that the counter-battery effort will be terminated. Enemy insurgents will be delighted when they learn and experience that they will not be immediately targeted and brought under fire by the military. Where our enemies worked very hard to launch a single rocket, there will be little reason to not launch entire batteries of rockets. There will be no military consequences for them. Commission concerns were recently validated by our June 21, 2010 Capitol Hill hearing. Among the troubling testimony we heard that day was what you've previously mentioned, Mr. Chairman. The Department of State estimates that without U.S. military support, it will need to raise its private security force from 2,700 to almost 7,000. Under Secretary of State Patrick Kennedy wrote to the Department of Defense almost 6 months ago to request a substantial amount of military information plus continued access to the Army's LOGCAP logistics contract and continued food and fuel supply through the Defense Logistics Agency. And we found that DOD's Joint Staff at that time had not forwarded that request with a recommendation to the Office of the Secretary. We've been informed informally that they have, but we attempted to reach confirmation on that and we were unable. In summary, State Department program leaders have been dealt a hand that includes unknown contract and program support from the Department of Defense, funding limitations likely to impact their mission capability, and the need to contract for and perform functions that have never been done by their department. We believe that the State Department has been placed in an unfair position as they work to deliver on critical mission requirements in the continuing effort to stabilize and reconstruct Iraq. That includes our joint statement, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Issa. We thank the committee for its attention and welcome your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony, and we will now start the questioning period. Each member, of course, will have 5 minutes, and I will begin. Your July report highlights very significant problems with transition planning for the Defense Department handoff to the State Department. Are we facing a potential disaster at this point?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure if I would refer to it as a potential disaster. We certainly are facing the potential for significant contract cost overruns, inefficiencies, and potential fraud, waste, and abuse if this transition occurs in the form of what might be called a pickup game.
What do we need to do to fix this problem?
Well, in our statement, senior executive leadership needs to address this. Our recommendation is at the secretarial level. There has been some coordination in theater now as a result of our concerns and concerns raised by others, but it's at the middle management level. There needs to be This needs to be pushed up to the highest levels within State and Defense because it's that important.
Right. Your report lists 14 security-related tasks currently performed by DOD that will soon be transferred to State. Functions such as recovering killed and wounded soldiers will become a State Department responsibility. Who will be performing these functions?
Mr. Chairman, some of those 14 functions will probably fall off the table. They will not. It will not be necessary to do them, but the majority of them will. And in most cases, there will be contractors performing those functions. There's a lot of coordination currently being done now between State Department and the Defense Department on what equipment can be left behind, for example, medical support. There's a dialogue ongoing now to see what medical support could be left behind by DOD to support the State Department. But some of these missions, for example, route clearance, which had heretofore been done by the Department of Defense, will fall principally to either contractors, and they plan on using UAVs to perform that mission. The main question and the answer is that these functions will essentially be done by contractors. And I think that obviously creates difficulties. You mentioned them in your opening remarks. Inherently governmental functions. There's great concern here in this body and across America, and in some cases, about personal security contractors. But we forget about all these other things that are military or quasi-military that will now be done by contractors. One of the most extreme examples that I can think of is the State Department has asked for MRAPs. The Defense Department has at least verbally indicated they will provide those vehicles. They will be driven by contractors. And if there are occasions when they go into high-threat areas and they have weapons mounted, those weapons will, as it stands right now, be manned by contractors.
I'm thinking about all these security contractors. You know, what are the problems that we face in terms of the department face managing all of these security contracts? I mean, it seems to me that you're going to probably double or maybe even triple the amount that's in there now.
Right. Mr. Chairman, the management of security contractors for the Department of Defense and the Department of State has been a challenge. There have been numerous instances that we have reported where they're not providing the kinds of quality and background investigation that many of the security officials or contractors should have. In the case of State Department, they're going to be challenged with potentially tripling the size of their security force. It's unprecedented. They acknowledge it's unprecedented. The other item I think that's important that Commissioner Green brought up is many of these inherently governmental items that are being transitioned to State from the military represent items where this Commission feels that the United States military is the superior performer, and many of them relate to security. And with no disrespect for contractors, those items that are inherently governmental, where a professional military best performs it, should and could remain with the military.
Let me be very basic. What can we do to make this transition work?
I think two things come to mind. And that is the increased, expanded, and continuing dialogue and coordination between the State Department and the Defense Department. As Chairman Thibeault mentioned in his opening remarks, there has been a dialogue. It has mostly been at the middle management level. They've certainly progressed from the time that I was in country, the end of May, and spent a week with the State Department talking about the transition. U.S. Forces Iraq has been very forthcoming in providing liaison people and advisors to the embassy. But that's got to continue. Where I see a void is, and I go back to my time in the State Department when I was responsible for, on the State side, for the transition from the Coalition Provisional Authority, Ambassador Bremer, to the new embassy. And I had a counterpart from the Defense Department, a retired Army Lieutenant General that worked directly for the Secretary. He was that belly button. And he came over there with a gaggle of colonels and helped us through that process. That process was nothing compared to what we're facing today. And where I see a hole is that we don't have, or I don't know of a person, we don't have a senior person, single person from the Defense Department that can run interference and make things happen. We mentioned the LOGCAP contract and the request for equipment and support for LOGCAP DLA that went to the State Department, went to the Defense Department in April. As far as we know, it's still sitting there. We need somebody that can walk into the Deputy's office or even the Secretary's office and say, sir, we got to move this. We have to make a decision. If it's yes, great. If it's no, let's make a decision, because much of the planning that State has to do today in country cannot be done until they know the status of LOGCAP, as an example.
And, Mr. Chairman, one simple add-on to that is anything that this committee can do to compel the Department of Defense to provide support to the Department of State where it is needed and where they have that kind of expertise and can influence the criteria for providing that support is needed.
I only answered part of your question because you said, Mr. Chairman, what else can we do?
Right.
I think the other key element here is a stable and reliable funding stream to State. I can tell you from my 4 years there, budget is always a problem. And today it's more of a problem. And I'm just afraid that, and we've already seen some decrements in the supplemental for Iraq support to both State and Defense. I am concerned that when the spotlight is off this transition and it's forgotten about, and States doing their thing, and they've taped this thing together, and I'm confident it will happen. It'll work, but a lot can fall through the cracks. We've got to have stable funding when no longer is this the top priority after Afghanistan.
And it seems to be a big crack.
It's a big crack.
That's right.
It's a big crack.
I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, ranking member of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm going to stay right along your line of questioning. Let me start off by reminding all of us on this side and informing you. A while back we did a good and important hearing that sort of was sad, and that was on how the Coast Guard decided it was going to create its fleet of blue water naval ships, if you will, and they didn't know how to do it. And the end result is we've got ships that are going to break in half sooner than they normally do. And it boils down to less life because they didn't have the right designers. And they were designing a ship that was substantially similar to ones that were designed by the Navy successfully for years. That taught all of us something, which is that procurement doesn't belong just to the agency doing it. It belongs to this committee to find and ensure that if the skills exist in one part, under one stovepipe of Congress and one stovepipe of the administration, and the need is in another, we have an obligation to either assist or deconflict. I think we have that here today. I think we can all agree on that. Let me start by asking a question for the record, which is, does State Department have the acquisition skills by any stretch of the imagination to acquire 7,000 people and commensurate hard assets to do the type of security, protection, and missions in Iraq that we see for at least the next year?
I would answer that, Mr. Congressman, Congressman Issa, that they do have acquisition skill sets to award contracts.
That's not my question, though.
I think the contract oversight and the management of that is absolutely strained to the max now. They have been providing some additional support for contract oversight based on need. If you triple the force, for example, of private security contractors, the inference is clear. You're going to have, if you want to have boots on the ground to take a look and make sure that they are complying with use of force criteria, you have to have the people to do the oversight. That's going to be a challenge that.
Okay, but let's break it down a little differently. Do they know how to buy Predator aircraft?
No.
Figure out which one.
Not
Do they
presently.
They know how to buy armored vehicles.
They don't have experience.
Okay, they don't know how to buy anti-mortar, anti-missile systems.
They're going to have to learn how.
Do they?
No. They don't
Mr.
have
Green,
that experience.
If they don't have that experience, and if 100% of the skills exist in the United States military, both for acquisition and among our uniformed men and women, and they have historically done a big part of the job, as distasteful as it is to say we're going to break with long tradition of having military not standing next to ambassadors as they go into heads of state and so on, aren't we just arguing over the uniform? And let me just give you a hypothetical, because it's beyond the jurisdiction of this committee but not beyond our imaginations. If we look at our 50,000 men and women already there and we segment or ask the administration to consider segmenting this role on a seconded basis to where they would assume those additional duties as they have in the past, if we do that, don't we save money, save trying to train, and in the case of men and women in uniform who have been doing much of this job, save using private contractors who ultimately, as patriotic as they might be, are in fact more alien to the process of protecting our diplomatic service than the military itself is?
State would be thrilled to have that support, and in fact will need it and have asked for it. Just go back to LOGCAP as an example. If DOD in their wisdom says, okay, we'll support you with LOGCAP for the next 1, 2, whatever years, and we will provide also that oversight and management, that mechanism that's in place today to oversee those contracts. They also would want, and you mentioned UAVs and CRAM, they also will need help and will ask for help and have asked for help as they begin to develop those requirements.
So to put it short, this is a gaping hole which we're deeply concerned about, and the time is ticking down to zero, and yet it is by definition a self-inflicted wound if it's not necessary to move it, but rather a decision for the military to shed something for whatever reason, when in fact the most capable, most cost-effective support might in fact already exist with our military and have no justification for the long run for most of the rest of the world for our men and women in the diplomatic service.
Believe me, State Department knows where their weaknesses are and has reached out, and I hope will continue to reach out to the Defense Department in those areas where Defense obviously has the expertise.
Well, as we continue to look at it, I'm going to only close with one question. I know we're talking, and your specific expertise is in Iraq, but we have Iraq and Afghanistan. We also have the Horn of Africa, and we have other areas around the world that are hot, can become super hot, and could fit the same model. Don't we have an obligation to have an answer that isn't simply go look for recently departed from the military personnel to bring them in as contractors, but rather have a in-sourced, in-government group of people who can meet those responses, which could escalate as quickly. I shouldn't say as they de-escalate, because they don't seem to de-escalate quickly, but they do escalate quickly. Isn't that true?
Mr. Congressman, Congressman Issa, we would absolutely agree with that. And the fact that the United States Army now has a core capability. They have more than 200 individuals on a team in Iraq right now doing LOGCAP, for example. There are no State employees doing LOGCAP. The only alternative is contractor or our contractor employees. Your reference to other theaters is spot on. There is an absolute need to be able to respond quickly and effectively.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope we have a second round. I think this is a good line of questioning, and I appreciate your time and yield back.
Right. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Congressman Kucinich.
Thank you, Mr. Tebow. I'm going over your testimony, what you've read and didn't read that's in your prepared statement. And I see phrases like no clear guiding policy, a pickup game, lack of transparency, visibility, and basic data, transition, limbo, State required to undertake a very large, hurried, expensive, and unprecedented exercise in contracting, functions falling off the table, diplomatic presence reestablished and expanding in a country that appears unable to provide normal host country security and services. There's another way to caption this, fiasco. I mean, and this is not about fault. It's a fiasco. That's what you've described. Now, I think, you know, when you hear about this discussion about Department of Defense and State, it's like we're talking about two different countries here, just within the same government. So what's really going on here? I think this is a teachable moment, Mr. Chairman. Let's look at the Washington Post's account yesterday of Bob Woodward's new book. Here's a quote. I want everyone to think about this. Woodward quotes General Petraeus as saying, quote, "You have to recognize also that I don't think you win this war. I think you keep fighting." It's a little bit like Iraq, actually. He's talking about Afghanistan, but then he says, yes, there have been enormous progress in Iraq, but there are still horrific attacks in Iraq. You have to stay vigilant. You have to stay after it. This is the kind of fight we're in for the rest of our lives and probably our kids' lives, unquote. The Washington Post, the same Washington Post article also tells of a real struggle inside the administration where President Obama, quote, kept asking for an exit plan to go along with, let's see. Obama kept asking for an exit plan to go along with any further troop commitment and is showing growing increasingly frustrated with the military hierarchy for not providing one. So I think what's going on here, based on what this testimony is that the Department of Defense isn't getting its way. The top military commanders like Petraeus want to stay in Iraq. And so it's okay with them if the State Department's mission collapses, because it then opens the door for them to come in and to stay. It's so clear. This is so clear to see. And this testimony has to be put in the context of a desire of certain top military commanders to thwart, frustrate, delay, and otherwise impede an exit strategy from Iraq. I mean, this Woodward book is an important book that's coming out. But you have to look at the struggle that's been going on within the administration to try to end the war. There are people, they might be good soldiers, they might be fine individuals, but they should not be making the policy for the United States of America. That's up to the President of the United States. And we see this report. It's a very disturbing report in Woodward's book. And when you hear this testimony today, and you put it together with this emerging view of what's going on, there's just no question that the Department of Defense will do anything it can at this point to thwart the mission of the State Department to try to achieve a peaceful transition. Very clear. That's what's really going on here. It's just so clear. I'm amazed that You can't say it, Mr. Thibeault, but you've said it in so many words or less. And I don't think that I have numerous questions to ask you, but after I read your report and I'm thinking about what I read yesterday, Mr. Chairman, what we really ought to be doing is calling the Secretary of Defense in front of this committee and General Petraeus and get them to explain why they're not cooperating with the State Department. That's what we really need to do.